Hi everyone, welcome to the channel, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for continuing to support the channel, and if this is your first time on the channel, then welcome. Consider to subscribe and hit the like button if you think this video is beneficial and we should continue producing the content that we are. In this video I will talk about the work of Mircea Eliade, an anthropologist, a ethnologist, a historian, and I would say, a great Jungian. Although he doesn't make it explicit, Eliade's work is deeply influenced by the theories of Jung, or let's say the underlying premises of it. Because Eliade's work in its structure or its content, it's not psychological or psychoanalytic in its intent. It does instead observe or analyze sort of the workings of men in relation to nature, if you will. So specifically what I'll look at today is his work, Cosmos and History, the Myth of Eternal Return. And of course what he means by eternal return is the eternal return to the same sort of patterns of behavior, and of course what that means for us, and we know that, is the return to the same sort of archetypal way of action, or archetypal sort of reflex. And there's another great book that I recommend you have a look at. It's the work of Anthony Stevens, Archetype and Natural History of the Self. And in this book, it's quite, I would say it's a good introductory book. So Anthony Stevens compares Jung's archetypes with the behaviorist work of Bowlby and Lawrence. So essentially biological behaviorism, if you will, looking at the way in which animals, sort of animal reflexive behavior or innate patterns of behavior, innate response mechanisms, if you will. That's what Bowlby and Lawrence are interested in. And essentially they look at it, or Anthony Stevens looks at those in terms of Jung's work of the archetype. And we can see here, for example, that Konrad Lorenz argues here that the system of sense organs and nerves that enables living things to survive and orient themselves in the outer world has evolved phylogenetically through confrontation with an adaptation to the form of reality which we experience as phenomenological space. Apologies. The system exists a priori to the extent that it is present before the individual perceives anything and must be present if experience is to be possible. The idea here being that you have, right, for example, you have this specific species of birds that have been preyed upon, or is it birds actually? No, it's chicks. It's chicks. So chicks, baby chicks. And baby chicks have been historically scared of hawks, of predatory birds. And you have those, essentially you have the reaction. So chicks will react to hawks even if they've never seen a hawk, and that's even true for generations. They've never encountered a hawk. So it could be, 200 years, let's say, in terms of generational difference, or let's say 200 generations difference between a chick that has encountered a hawk and the chick that you're experimenting with, and they're still crouch whenever you pull up a wooden model of a hawk. It doesn't even have to be a hawk. It could just be the behavioral pattern, which tells you a lot about perception, by the way, right? Like the way perception works. It doesn't care if this is an actual hawk or not. And this is quite interesting. Humans have the same reaction, by the way. Like if you see a shadow in the dark in front of your window, you don't care if this is an actual human. You don't care if this is an intruder. You don't care if this is a wild animal. You will react the way you have reacted for thousands of years whenever a wild animal would sort of pull up in front of your fireplace or in front of your hut or whatever it was. And you don't process. It tells you a lot about cognitive processing, right? Because we think that we're so sophisticated in processing stimuli in terms of, look, like I can discern between an actual threat and a non-actual threat, or I know on a symbol. Like I know this water vessel is what it is. Like we think we're so, or I know this is a book, but we don't. You don't know book. You don't know, like I've emphasized this in other videos. Like we don't know book. Like, we don't know water vessel. We don't know a mouse. Like we don't know microphone. Like what we know is the shapes, the edges, the curves, the curvature of the edges, the shadows they cast, and the relationship of those to each other. That's what we know. That's what we can process. That's how visual processing works. It's very low resolution. It's very, very simple. And then we map that onto existing complexes or patterns of visual stimuli that we've encountered before. And in order to then form a judgment, a quick judgment, and if it's the judgment danger, no danger, it's very low resolution, right? And the judgment, fight, flight, is low resolution. The judgment, the response judgments can almost be instinctual in a way. And then higher up the hierarchy, we can map it onto memory, and you're like, oh, actually, this kind of looks like a hawk. You recognize the word hawk. You map it onto whatever's going on. But in the first instance, you run, right? And so but what is crucial in this sort of in Lawrence and Bowlby's work is that these innate response patterns, they're intergenerational. They're a priori, and they say in a Kantian sense, right? And which I don't want to comment on in this point, but in this video, but they say in a priori in the sense of they precede us. They're here before we are here. We cannot escape them, and in that manner. The archetype functions similarly, but what's important here is that what they are arguing is essentially that and what Stevens is therefore arguing is that the archetype corresponds to these patterns, and of course what precedes these patterns is the continuous or eternal encounter with nature as it was presented to us, out there, let's say. So, and it's an interesting discussion, and I think Lawrence makes the argument that actually, or attempts to solve this issue of transcendent idealism, where you have basically the idea, okay, would the world have significance without the psyche? And there are, for example, the work of Bernardo Kastrup is he argues that Jung is a transcendental idealist. He says basically there would be this without the psyche, the world would have no significance. I'm not sure if you go as far as saying there would be no world, but certainly there would be no world as we know it in a way. And so the idea here really is that basically because the psyche has a specific structure, it manipulates the world to become what it is. And Lawrence says, and the other standpoint, of course, is that the world presents itself as it is, and we just accept it as it is, it is what it is. It's there. We're in the world, and the middle position, Lawrence says that basically you have a co-shaping, like you have the world as it is that activates certain behavioral patterns that are there a priori that then shape the world as it presents itself to the mind, right? So if you have the ego, the ego of course presents itself as an ego, but its specific meaning to us, right? It's and meaning defined here interestingly by response, right? The response determines the meaning, right? If we respond in a certain way, it has a certain meaning. And of course, if you think about the archetype, that's kind of really what's going on in a way, right? We respond in a certain manner, and that's why we know a certain archetype has been activated, right? It's kind of like the archetype as such doesn't even exist, right? And I've said this in multiple instances, that we can't discern an archetype by itself, right? We can't say this is the archetype of the shadow, because we can only say, oh yeah, right, this appears to me, or this image activates in me, if you will, the archetype of the shadow-ish like behavior kind of thing. It's a response-driven mechanism, and therefore, or thereby, we can say we spoke about these complexes that cluster around certain archetypal cores or archetypal trajectories, right? And you can check it out. I'll post a video link to those videos somewhere here. If you haven't watched those, you should watch those. I think it's interesting and fundamental to understand how the archetype actually works, or what the dynamic is. Like how it actually translates to the individual psyche, right? And it gives you some fundamentals on the archetype, I think, that are important to understand the discussions we're having here. But the idea really is that if you have those complexes, they map onto the kinds of percepts, the kind of low resolution structures that you have perceived before, that map onto a certain archetypal sort of core due to the responses that they sort of evoke, right? And so you have actually you have a clustering of response patterns and their correspondence in sort of the external world that you've lived through. And so you have this dynamic where the archetypes always again becomes manifested in reality, right? You have this abstract archetypal, let's say, trajectory that always again, over and over and over again, becomes manifested in reality. And so if you think about Eliade's work, right, you have this gesture of eternal repetition, right? You have this gesture of repetition which is inherent in the archetype, because the archetype is repeated over and over again. And what you have in Eliade as well, of course, is this distinction between sacred and profane methods of repeating. You know, Eliade says, for example, in one of his chapters here, in one of the first chapters, he says that certain behaviors can be holy and others can be profane. Of course, he talks about that in his book, The Holy and the Profane. But the point that he makes here is that the same behavior can become sort of desacralized by virtue of repetition, and what makes it holy is its reference to pre-existent, archetypal, let's say, core, and its active reference to that in a way, and this I think nicely links to the work of Jean Baudrillard, where you have this notion of simulation, where you have basically, you have let's say, you have a certain city that's rebuilt that sort of resembles the way that old buildings have been. If you look at Germany, you have these old, I'm not sure what the English word is. Let me. Truss, no. Half-timbered house. Well, you have these. I'll blend it. I'll put an image up here in editing the video, but you have they're called Fachwerk houses, so it's like a half-timbered house. You have timber, and then you have certain like brick, and it's a very specific way that German houses used to be built over the years, and you have those original houses in place, in lots of villages that haven't been destroyed in the wars, and then you have new people building new houses in the exact same way. And Baudrillard would say these new houses are only sort of simulating these old houses, simply because what happens is you used to build these old houses because of certain necessities, right? You reference, let's say, certain natural occurrences. You behaved in reference to certain natural circumstances that you responded to in a way that was eternal, right? You would return to this holy space, this community space where you would be one with like sort of your ancestors, your ancestry, and everything sort of that plays into that, in order then to respond to it in the same sort of behavioral pattern, which created or recreated this holy space, this sort of holy, this holy community body, right? And what happens today is you just copy the outcome, right? You just say, it's like dance. Eliade gives the example of dance. He says, look, dance would always be in reference to a certain you'd say totem, like animals, or to you're reenacting your totem animal, your spirit animal. And today, dance is sort of just it's an appropriation of that, right? It's like you still have drums, you still have, but it doesn't. There's no meaning. It's not endowed or enchanted with meaning. And even now, it gets even worse if we start saying, "Oh, actually, I'm doing this because I'm trying to discover my whatever," and all these sort of new age. That's why new age sort of behaviors are so empty, because there's this gap, right? There's this gap between the necessity of the dance in terms of the psychological participation mystique, right? The mystical participation, the oneness you have with nature, and then the actual action or performance of the dance, right? Apologies. And you know, for example, you say you have this example here that where he says, you know, you had a certain herb that would return your manlyhood, like that would help you with erection problems, essentially, right? And today we take medication for that as well, right? But the sacrality of it is broken, because what you do is you take the medication in order to achieve a discrete end, which doesn't have anything to do with your entirety, right? And back then this herb would be like very fundamentally associated with an element of you projected outwardly, you know, a god that would be made, you know, sort of made happy, kind of, in order to return your manliness to you, right? And otherwise you would be empty. You would be, it's like this example, you know, you perform a certain ritual to make the sun rise again and so on. So I think it's crucial to understand here this detachment. And so we see that Eliade basically suggests in this myth of eternal return, what he suggests is that what you do essentially in the archetypal moment is you repeat, you have this element of repetition, you repeat that which happened in before time, and you repeat it over and over again. And this before time, of course, becomes fictional, right? It doesn't exist, right? It's like if you think about the God and the reenaction of Christ's sort of death on the cross. You know, like human life, human existence is a reenaction of the life of Christ and his death on the cross, right? What does that exactly mean, right? It doesn't. It basically renders this moment of, and this is, I think, interesting. This is in Jung too, right? It makes this moment of Christ's death on the cross, takes it as a fictional, like removes it as an actual event, positions it as a fictional something you can repeat in life as a role model, and then attempts to sort of relive that in a certain moment, but thereby it removes the reality of this actual event from the event. And so it's this idea that you actually, the ritual is there to remove the possibility of the actual events breaking into the linearity of the ego, right? So, and the same goes for sort of this idea of voluntary submission to the archetypal influx, right? We know, okay, so in the logic, you have this dynamic between the ego and the archetype that we've discussed a lot of times, right? You have the ego that holds on to its linearity, and you have the archetype that's sort of underlying, you know, you have the ego that suppresses, if you will, the reality of the complexes and their sort of individual meanings and their independence, and the archetype sort of at the center of those complexes, which sort of drives the energy through them into the ego and is able to rupture the ego's linearity. And so the ego is always struggling to suppress or to protect itself, rather. I don't think it's an active act of suppression, but it's more of a protective act, saying, look, I don't want to die, you know, I don't want to get ruptured. Like it's almost, if you think about it, it's almost like saying that you have this moment of this protective moment of the city walls. And so what you do is actually you protect yourself from the enemy influx. But here's the thing, right? And this is sort of the tension that you have there. It's a tension between you have to protect yourself from the enemy that's coming in, but at the same time you have to correspond with it, right? You have to perform some act of diplomacy, right, in order to continue to know it, in order to you know, because otherwise, if you don't know the archetype, if you don't voluntarily submit yourself to it, what's going to happen is it's going to surprise you and take you by surprise and sort of shock you and then rupture you even more. And so that's the sort of the moment that I think Eliade is also describing, right? You want to relive that moment of creation in order to keep the actual moment of creation at a distance. And so this sort of tension is what the ego is grappling with all the time, and the way that has been dealt with it. It's essentially the idea of voluntarily descending into hell, but hell is then a little less threatening, right, if you voluntarily descend to it, right? And you always have this sort of this leftover threat or this leftover fear that actually hell could be really bad, but you don't know, but it could be. And so So I think this is sort of the function of the ritual to some extent, and it helps support the ego in its strength, but it at the same time it helps it sort of protect it from the influx of the actual archetype. Okay, well, thank you very much for tuning in again, and see you next time. Consider to subscribe and hit the like button if you like this video, and I'd like to know in the comments what other videos I should make or what points in this video I should go into in more depth. Thank you very much.